We'll go ahead and start the webinar. I'd like to welcome you to 2021 Trends, Helping Nonprofits Find More Corporate Sponsorship. My name is Ken Unger, and I'm the president of Charge, a sponsorship consulting agency. Today's webinar will be about identifying trends. The way we've set it up is a two-part webinar. We wanted to pull together all the information that we felt would be of interest to nonprofits and helping them build powerful sponsorships around the topics that we're going to present today and build revenue for your organizations. Now, there was so much material to cover that it would have been probably about 2 hours worth of material. And rather than have a long buffet of all this information where everyone falls asleep after a long buffet at the end, we wanted to create something that was more bite-sized. So we divided it into two parts. Today, we're going to be talking about those trends that impact corporate sponsorship for nonprofits in 2021. And then next week, we're going to talk about in a very granular way how to leverage those trends, specifically with tactics for you to build sponsorships for your nonprofit if you're from a nonprofit. So thank you very much for investing the next hour with us. We have a great turnout for today's webinar with nonprofit and for-profit organizations representing organizations in the United States and Canada. So for those of you in the Eastern and Central time zone, good afternoon. For those in the Mountain and Pacific time zones, good morning. Let's go ahead and get started. So this webinar will be recorded, and just wanted to let you know that we're doing so because if you wanted to go back and listen or watch any part of it, that this webinar will be available on demand for you, again, free of charge. So you can watch the webinar afterwards. And speaking of free of charge, I'd like to thank our sponsor. It's probably appropriate that a webinar on sponsorship has a sponsor, and we have a great one. CBIZ Retirement Plan Services has graciously extended its support to this webinar so that all the attendees can attend free of charge. CBIZ has a representative on this panel today, Pete Walkie, and I'll be introducing him in a moment. But I wanted to thank CBIZ Retirement Plan Services for its generous support of this webinar. Now, there will be a survey at the end of this webinar. We're always interested in continuous improvement. And to the extent that we can do things better, we would love to have your input. If you think that we did things well, we always like to hear that as well. But if you can leave your browser open at the end of the webinar, the survey will automatically populate. It'll just take a few minutes post-webinar. We would really appreciate the feedback. So there are questions that some of you offered during registration. We had a section of the registration where you could create questions that you would like us to address. We had great feedback. We had a number of questions about whether small nonprofits could take advantage of this, whether virtual events play a role in sponsorship, what to do in the event of canceled sponsorship events, how to find sponsors, and whether event decks, sponsorship proposals are still relevant, and if so, what should be in it. Those topics we're going to speak about in the second webinar specifically. If we have time at the end of this webinar, we could begin to delve into those questions. But there were several other questions that were right on point for what we're going to talk about today, and that is, during the COVID-19 pandemic, what are those pivots that a nonprofit can engage in to find sponsorship and build revenue? And also, what is the role of CSR, of corporate social responsibility, in sponsorship, and how can you leverage that? Those are two questions that we're going to address throughout this section of the webinar. But I'd like to encourage you, there's the Q&A tab at the bottom of your Zoom control panel. Please feel free to submit questions We will answer them during the webinar, and also we will leave time at the end of this particular webinar to get all of your questions answered, or at least as many as we can in the time allotted. So with that said, let's go ahead and get started. So I mentioned my name is Ken Unger, the president and founder of Charge, a sponsorship consulting agency. I have 25 years experience in and around sponsorship. We represent both sponsors and rights holders in creating high-performing relationships in sponsorship. We have experience with Global 50 companies, and some of our clients are as small as $250,000 a year in annual revenue. So we really run the gamut in helping organizations of all kinds make the most of sponsorship. I'm joined on the panel today by Pete Walke. Pete is corporate retirement plan advisor for CBIZ Retirement Plan Services. Pete has 27 years of experience advising for-profits and not-for-profits in structuring their retirement plans. Pete has handled retirement plans that are as large as $500 million in plan assets and organizations that have as many as 14,000 employees. Pete is not only skilled at retirement plan advice, but Pete is also an accomplished author. He has 3 books, 2 on personal finance and 1 on leadership. So we're really lucky to have Pete here joining us to talk about trends, because today's webinar is really about trends that impact nonprofits. So when we talk about trends, we're going to talk about consumer and for-profit trends related to social responsibility that create a more positive environment for nonprofit corporate sponsorship. So the things that we're going to do today is we're going to identify that trend and the 3 things that make up that trend, how this trend directly impacts corporate sponsorship. But I think that just theory by itself is not of much use to the people who are attending this webinar today. So we're going to give you very specific things to leverage these trends, to be able to speak to them comfortably in the process of engaging sponsors in conversations about corporate sponsorship for nonprofits, so that this webinar will really be news you can use. And you can take the things that we talk about in this webinar and apply them next week. We talk about the specific tactics that are going to help you gain sponsorship partners and build revenue for your nonprofits. Now, I'd like to turn it over to Pete. He's going to tell you a little about our sponsor, CBIZ Retirement Plan Services, and a little about trends that impact you directly as nonprofits.
Thanks, Ken. Welcome, everybody. Hopefully the sun is shining where you are today. It is here in Indianapolis, and we're glad you could join us for a few minutes today. My role, as Ken said, is a retirement plan advisor for CBIZ. We're a publicly traded firm. We've got national resources, but we try to give you that personalized service. And we manage about $56 billion of retirement plan assets for our clients. And if you put that in comparison to the world's population is just under 8 billion. So it's about 7 times the size of the world's population and assets that we manage. So we've got a pretty good handle on this business. And the big picture today is Ken's going to provide some ideas to increase revenues for your organization. And I'm going to share just a couple ideas on how you can decrease expenses, specifically in your retirement plans. And either way, whichever ideas you implement, the result is the same. It's a financially healthier organization. Go ahead, Ken, to the next slide. So I'm going to take you back in memory lane a little bit, go back to high school, and think of the first car that you ever drove or that you purchased on your own. And for me, it was that '79 Cutlass on the left. It was an awesome car. I saved up from cutting grass and yard work several years, and then I purchased it. It had that old radio in it that had the dial with the line that would go back and forth, and it had an 8-track player, believe it or not. But the cool part about that car is it had electric windows. And we had a lot of great memories, hauling my friends around, probably doing things we shouldn't have been doing. But I actually loved that car. It was awesome. The downside is it got 15 miles to the gallon, and I had to put more oil in it than gas, it seemed like. It seemed like every other week I was pouring oil into it. Expenses were quite a bit. And so if you fast forward today, the car on the right is, that's the car I drive today. It's a 2016 Toyota Camry hybrid. And in contrast, it gets about 43 miles to the gallon. And just this morning, I had my 100,000 mile tune-up, and I changed the oil once every 10,000 miles. So to put this into perspective, if we were to take a drive from New York City to Los Angeles, you drove the Camry and I drove the Cutlass, I would have to stop 2 to 3 times more than you to fill up for gas. And it would cost pretty much twice as much, and it'd be half as effective. The Camry has all the latest airbags, all the latest technology, and the Cutlass didn't have any of that stuff. So when you talk about trends in the nonprofit retirement plans, they tend to be twice as expensive and half as effective. And let me explain. So there are typically 3 reasons why that happens. Number one is there's not a plan advisor working with the organization. So they would go directly to Fidelity or Vanguard or any of the other plan providers out there. And most people think, well, if I don't have an advisor, I don't have to pay that advisor, it's going to be less expensive. That really the opposite's true. The second reason is that organizations that are nonprofit tend to pay expenses out of pocket. So whether you pay $5,000 a year or $25,000 a year or $125,000 a year for your retirement plan, the expenses and the advisor, if you're still paying that out of pocket, you don't have to. And then the third reason why plans tend to be twice as expensive is that nonprofits tend not to go back and renegotiate the fees once a year like we do with all of our clients. So there are 3 ways we could help you. Number one, we could eliminate that out-of-pocket expense that you have, and you could take that money and put it somewhere else into the budget. We have a few techniques that we can do, and it doesn't increase costs for employees, and you don't have to change your retirement plan advisor to do that. The second thing we can do on your behalf, we can go back and renegotiate the fees. With our $56 billion of retirement plan assets, when we go to renegotiate fees with a plan provider, they know that if they don't reduce the fees, that there's a chance that we could go out and bid the plan out into the market. And they know it's less expensive to keep your plan with lower fees than it is to find another client. And then the third thing we can do is a share class review. If you haven't had your share classes reviewed in each of your individual mutual funds each year, then you're leaving money on the table and it's a lot more expensive. And here in Indianapolis, Anthem, the insurance company, just settled a $26 million lawsuit about 1.5 years ago because they were with Vanguard, and most people think Vanguard's a low-cost fund family, but they had almost all Vanguard funds and they were not in the lowest share class. So it left millions and millions of dollars on the table, and it was costing the employees well more than it should. So if you'd like us to help you out, we're happy to do a no-cost plan assessment. My contact information will be there at the end of the webinar. Thanks, Ken.
Thanks, Pete. Really appreciate it. And as we've talked about, there are 2 ways for a nonprofit to increase the bottom line, and that is not only to increase revenue, which we're going to talk about, but to decrease costs. And we really appreciate Pete sharing that information with us to help you decrease the costs to your nonprofit. Well, thank you, Pete. We have a lot of people on this webinar today, and they have varying degrees of experience with sponsorship. We have people who are relatively new to sponsorship. And in looking at the list of attendees, we have people so experienced in sponsorship, some of them could actually be sitting in this chair teaching this webinar. But I think it's important for all of us to be on the same page about what sponsorship is. So sponsorship at its heart is a relationship. It is the act of providing money or other resources in exchange for mutual promotional benefit. And it's really important to recognize that sponsorship is different from other forms of marketing in that it's mutual. And we'll talk about things like advertising or other forms of marketing that are really a one-way communication from an advertiser, for example, to a consumer. But sponsorship is that mutual relationship between two parties. So let's talk about different relationship models of which sponsorship is a part. We're going to talk first about what I call a traditional relationship model. And then we're going to talk about how the trends that we're going to identify in this webinar have caused these traditional relationship models to change. So if you see on the slide, we're going to talk about relationship models that are on two ends of a range. And that range is the commercial motive of a sponsor or a donor. And on one end of the spectrum, there is high commercial motive. That is, the sponsor or the donor has a very high interest in extracting commercial benefit from a relationship. And on the other end, there's no commercial motivation. So if we look at that, obviously donation, and we've obviously tailored this to nonprofits. On one end, donation, there's no commercial motivation. It's a payment that is made by a donor that is really driven by the commitment to a nonprofit's cause. And in terms of the desire or need for promotional benefit, there is none. It's really doing good for good's sake. But on the other end of the spectrum, we have the traditional sponsorship model. And the traditional sponsorship model, and again, I'll give examples, and in this case, I would use an example from the world of sports sponsorship. There's a payment that's made by a sponsor. It is driven by commercial motives, and those commercial motives are usually twofold. One is either the sponsor wants to increase sales, or the sponsor wants to enhance their brand. Could be one or the other, or in some cases, both. But again, in terms of that promotional benefit, there must be a return on investment, because the traditional sponsorship model is a marketing expenditure made by the marketing department. So this is the department charged with the promotion and sale of goods and services for a company. So there must be a return on investment. So an example from the world of sports is my favorite baseball team, the Chicago Cubs, and say that they're sponsored by the Coca-Cola Company. Coca-Cola Company is paying a rights fee to the Chicago Cubs, and their motivation, they're driven by two commercial motives. They want to move cases of Coke, and they really want to sell soda both to the people who are at the ballpark enjoying the game, and to the fans of the Cubs wherever they might watch or listen to a Cubs game. They must have a return on investment. They must show that the sponsorship has resulted in the sale of more Coca-Cola, or that the brand has been enhanced in the eyes of the Chicago Cubs audience. Now, in this continuum of high commercial motive and no commercial motive, there sits in the middle kind of a murky area where purpose-driven sponsorship sits. And I know if you're involved in a not-for-profit, that you are aware, you are engaged probably in one form or another in purpose-driven sponsorship. And I can assure you that if we have 100 people on today's webinar, that there are 100 different definitions of purpose-driven sponsorship. But essentially at the heart, as we see it in sponsorship, there's a payment that is driven by mutual commitment. So there's obviously the commitment of the nonprofit, usually having an event or other activity that is furthering the cause, creating impact for your cause. And there's a commitment on the part of the sponsor to somehow support that cause. Just happens to be, in this case, it's through the vehicle of sponsorship. Now, because it's not donation, there is some type of recognition. So whether it's a gala or it's a 5K race, there's an element of recognition where the nonprofit is recognizing the sponsor and thanking them for their support of that particular event or endeavor. More than that, in terms of the return on investment, that's where things get very murky. And in the past, in this traditional relationship model, purpose-driven sponsorship has not been seen as a vehicle to create those elements of return on investment, namely increase of sales and enhanced brand that would benefit the marketing department side of the corporate equation. And an example of that I always see is when I take my family to a zoo or an aquarium, I would see an exhibit, let's say a shark tank in an aquarium that's sponsored by a local law firm. That law firm would be thanked by the aquarium for their generous support of the shark tank. And the law firm's name would be put on the exhibit, a thank you, a little bit about the law firm, and that would probably be the extent of that particular sponsorship. Did the law firm, when they were looking back on that particular expenditure, did they expect to get clients out of that sponsorship? Probably not. Did they expect for their brand to be enhanced? A little bit. But because this is this in the traditional model was a purpose-driven sponsorship, for them it was really about doing what they could do to support the positive endeavor that's supported by that aquarium, and furthering the cause, for example, of, say, animal conservation. Now, that model has evolved. And because of the trends that we'll talk about in just a moment, the purpose-driven sponsorship can now achieve a very similar ROI to that traditional sponsorship model. The purpose-driven sponsorship will not be just a feel-good that the sponsor feels that they have supported the cause, but it can drive virtually the same ROI as the traditional sponsorship model. And that's the reason that we believe in the future, we're going to see a hybrid, especially as they pertain to nonprofits, of that purpose-driven sponsorship and the traditional sponsorship model as both sponsorships kind of merge for corporate sponsorship for nonprofits. We're going to see that more and more in the future. But that's a really important development in terms of what's available to nonprofits in terms of their potential to raise revenue. So what are these trends? I've done a lot to build up these trends over the last few minutes. But let's break it down. There are three aspects of this overall trend that's moving the sponsorship market towards purpose-driven sponsorship. The first is that consumers are demanding corporate social responsibility, or CSR. The second trend is that there is high international engagement with private companies around the topic of social responsibility. And the third trend is that the expectations of consumers impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic have added fuel to the trends that are on the left, both the expectation of corporate social responsibility and international engagement, to the extent that these trends are accelerating, not leveling off or diminishing. So we'll see more of these things in the future. Now, all three of these combined has created the need that companies must engage nonprofits through marketing, especially sponsorship, to accomplish the objectives that they have related to these trends. Let's look at these trends individually, break it down, and talk about the ways that you can leverage that in your discussions about corporate sponsorship. So the first, consumers are expecting CSR. That is not new. This is a trend that has been about a decade in the making, where consumers are voting with their wallets about the causes that are important to them. According to a survey done several years ago by Cone Communications, 87% of consumers surveyed have indicated that they would purchase a product because a company advocated for an issue that they care about. 87%. 76% said the opposite, that they would not buy a product or service from a company upon learning that that company supports an issue contrary to their beliefs. So this is a trend, again, that I mentioned is about 10 years in the making. Now, what's going to happen to this trend? Well, if all things being equal, you would expect it to either be the same or level off. However, if you look at the societal expectations of millennials and Gen Z, the generations that are coming up behind the baby boom and Gen X, these trends are actually picking up steam because millennials report that they feel even more strongly about social responsibility than their older counterparts. So as the baby boom ages and the millennials become not only the largest consumer block, but the largest block of employees, you're going to see this trend pick up steam. Now, as a result, there's been what I've called a revolution of responsibility in corporate boardrooms. And I've created here a word cloud that describes all the various trends within corporate America that really talk about the same thing, whether we're talking about CSR or conscious capitalism, or vehicles like B Corp certification or accountability. We're no longer talking about maximizing shareholder value. Now, when I was coming up in sponsorship on the company side, that was all the rage. It was about what we can do to maximize shareholder value, no more. Now it's talking about stakeholders, internal stakeholders, external stakeholders, public stakeholders, and private stakeholders, but it's all around social responsibility. So what we're seeing is where social responsibility was in one aspect of a company and the corporate social responsibility may have been on the shelf, it's now been taken off the shelf and has become the playbook for a company in terms of creating operations around its day-to-day within a business. So the second trend is about international engagement around social responsibility. So this really started about 6 years ago. In 2015, which was really a watershed year, I think a watershed year around social responsibility, two incredibly important things happened in 2015 on the international engagement front. The first was the Paris Climate Accord, which has been in the news quite a bit lately. But that Paris Climate Accord was negotiated and first ratified in 2015. But at the same time, the United Nations called on a conference which convened in New York City for sustainable development. And the sustainable development occurred in September of 2015 at the United Nations headquarters. And a really interesting happened. And again, these were trends that had started in the United Nations about 15 years before, but really were galvanized in 2015 when all United Nations member states resolved that between now and 2030, the member states resolved to end poverty and hunger everywhere, to combat inequality, to build peaceful, just, and inclusive societies, to protect human rights and promote gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls, and to ensure that the lasting protection of the planet and its natural resources. For me, what is interesting looking at it from the private sector side is it was time banded. So the member states of the United Nations had decided by 2030, we were going to accomplish this. Now, as a student of international public policy, as I used to be, it's really interesting. Usually the way that the United Nations and the member states go about this is by prescriptive policies within governments to pass laws, to create policies at a public policy level that encourage companies and others through law, through grants, through other financial incentives, the tax laws of various countries to engage in a certain goal. The United Nations didn't do that this time. Instead, they created the United Nations Global Compact. Now, the purpose of the Global Compact was based on the recognition that the United Nations knew that it couldn't go it alone, right? That member states alone could not create the change that was needed, because between 2015 and 2030 is 15 years to end poverty, to do all those things that were very ambitious and needed goals and necessary goals. They knew they couldn't do it just as member states. They knew they needed the private sector. So the UN Global Compact was a novel approach for the United Nations in engaging the private sector. And the way they were going to engage the private sector was to engage in a dialogue where private companies would specifically commit in writing to follow one of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. Now, the Sustainable Development Goals, or as you'll see in this presentation, the acronym is SDG. The SDGs represented all those things that I just described in the resolution, from ending poverty and ending hunger and respecting the planet, and all of those things. They were reduced to 17 discrete Sustainable Development Goals. And the UN Global Compact has been enormously successful in creating private sector support. So today, over 12,000 companies from 158 companies have committed in writing, signed by their CEOs, to commit to one or more of the SDGs that you see on this slide. These are companies that everyone would recognize. They're most of the companies in the US Fortune 500. They are most of the companies in the international Global 50. So here we have private commitment around public Sustainable Development Goals, which was an incredible trend at the time. Now, the third trend is, how has the COVID-19 pandemic shifted consumer expectations? And the answer is, it's been pretty significant. Through surveys that have started back last April, there is a pronounced movement among consumers to expect companies and brands to fill the void that consumers expected governments to fill. So there was general disappointment going back to last spring in government reaction. This is worldwide. Government reaction to the COVID-19 pandemic. So they were looking to companies, so consumers were looking to companies to fill that void. And companies, in large part, if you look at the things that happened back starting last April, May, June, companies were filling that void by increasing contributions to things like COVID-19 relief. But it sparked a further shift in what we've examined in that first trend, where consumers were expecting CSR. Now they were not only expecting companies to engage in corporate social responsibility, but as the Journal of Business Research noted, there was a significant shift in responsible and pro-social consumption, in the sense that consumers were reflecting on how they consume products and making choices responsible not only to themselves, but to others, society, and the environment. So while there has been a trend towards, one, CSR within companies and consumers voting with their wallets for CSR, international engagement around that, and international companies, including in the US and Canada and throughout the world, committing to the Sustainable Development Goals. But now there was fuel to that, where the COVID-19 pandemic has accelerated those trends to an even greater extent. Now, companies have a challenge. So if you are a CEO and you just signed your commitment letter to the UN Global Compact, and it said, I on behalf of my company, I am dedicating our company to the following Sustainable Development Goals. You are making that decision on behalf of your company and its board of directors, and you go back to the boardroom and you say to your team, we've made this commitment. The CEO turns to his or her COO and says to the COO, now it's your responsibility from an operations perspective to make sure that we're operating, that we're providing the goods and services that we sell in a socially responsible manner that I've just committed to the United Nations Global Compact. And the COO says, yes, I will do that. And the operations of the company begin to change. But then you turn the other way to your CMO and you say to him or her, you say, now you need to make people aware of our commitment to social responsibility. Because as I learned in public service, it's not enough to do good, you must be known for doing good. And these trends, the trends of consumers looking for companies to be socially responsible, do the companies no good if consumers don't know that these companies are actually acting in a socially responsible way. So it's now the province of the chief marketing officer to ensure that people know about the commitment to social responsibility, the status, how the operations of the company, and how the impact of the company is having a pro-society impact. These are all communications challenges. So the challenge for a company is how to express that social commitment. So you're now the CMO, you go back to your team, and now there are over 120 different marketing platforms for you to choose about how to express your social commitment. I've only listed 6 on this slide, but it's everything from social media to digital marketing through your website or your email marketing, sponsorship, experiential marketing through live events, or advertising or public relations. You need to choose the marketing platform that works best in communicating to the public, communicating to the consumers that you are committed to social responsibility and how you're committed. Our belief is that sponsorship will start to become that communications platform of choice by virtue of what sponsorship is. We talked earlier that sponsorship is a relationship, but it's a relationship where the property or the rights holder impliedly endorses the sponsor. There's an element of third-party ratification where, in my sports example earlier, the Chicago Cubs are endorsing Coca-Cola, saying that Coca-Cola is a great product. I endorsed CBIZ Retirement Plan Services as our sponsor for this webinar. There's an implied endorsement that you believe in the sponsor who is sponsoring your event. Otherwise, you would not have created that relationship. No other platform offers this strong benefit to the sponsor company. For example, if I'm advertising on the evening news is not saying I'm a great company just because I advertise on the news. Sponsorship is different. It's that relationship that really gives impetus to this implied endorsement. And so it works because of this theory called image transfer, which has been studied over the last 20 years by academics. I wanted to share this with you because image transfer is really important as you speak to sponsors who want to demonstrate their social commitment based on their commitment to SDGs or to corporate social responsibility. How image transfer works is the positive image of a property or a sponsored event actually enhances the image of the sponsor. That's why sponsorship is so successful, in that the sponsor understands that if I align with a certain property, in this case a nonprofit, that my image is going to be enhanced if the nonprofit has a positive image. So in this example, if a nonprofit in a certain community is known for feeding the hungry of that community, and a company sponsors that nonprofit, the public will believe that that sponsor must value food security as well. And the positive image of that nonprofit is transferred, becomes the positive image of that sponsor. This is what fuels sponsorship, and another reason why sponsorship will be the marketing platform of choice to describe the commitment of companies to social responsibility. So the major takeaways that I wanted you all to be aware of, the ways for you to leverage what we talked about in terms of the trends that have picked up steam really since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, are number one, through either traditional or purpose-driven sponsorships, your nonprofit can help a sponsor drive its sales and enhance its brand. If you take nothing else away from this webinar, this is crucial to remember. This is a game changer. Purpose-driven sponsorships aligned with nonprofits are no longer feel-goods. They can become a part of a marketing department's arsenal of tools to promote the sale of goods and services and enhance the brand of its company. And if it becomes part of that arsenal, remember that slide we talked about, where that $250 billion can start moving slowly but perceptibly towards nonprofits, that is a game changer. The second takeaway is consumers of companies are expecting social responsibility. So we're really in an age where forget about maximizing shareholder value. That is a relic of the past. It is now maximizing social value. And so consumers are expecting that and rewarding companies for it, but they're also punishing companies for it. And organizations, for-profits know this. And through a sponsorship relationship properly structured with your nonprofit, a sponsor can help demonstrate that commitment to social responsibility. And the third thing to remember is, if you are able to leverage this trend, this is the question that we had earlier about what is the COVID pivot? This is the COVID pivot. If you can effectively leverage this trend, there can be significant new resources available to your nonprofit. That is the pivot. The Council on Nonprofits has in its surveys, has estimated about 70% of nonprofits have experienced a donation decline because of COVID and the resulting recession. If you're looking for new revenue sources, this could be a significant new opportunity for your nonprofit. That is the COVID pivot. And also the way that you lever corporate social responsibility on the sponsor side to create new and positive relationships on your side. Now, I really want to focus on kind of a little bit of a preview for the next webinar, and then take the remaining time to answer questions. So if you were to express your, if a sponsor needed to express its social commitment through sponsorship, is your nonprofit in the best position to create these valuable relationships? So this is a sneak preview for next week's webinar. We're going to talk about, in pretty finite detail, the specific things you're going to be able to do to lever it. Also, the things that you need to keep in mind and prepare for if you're new to sponsorship, to create a sponsorship program from the ground up. First is being sponsorship ready. Now, an essential part of sponsorship is co-promotion. The sponsor is promoting the nonprofit, but the nonprofit is also promoting the sponsor. So sponsors are looking for nonprofits that can adequately promote their mission. And so the question of whether a nonprofit is sponsorship ready is really important, and the ability to meet sponsor expectations will indicate your success in attracting corporate sponsors. Crafting your value proposition, what you can offer to a for-profit that helps meet their challenges. We're going to talk about ways for you to craft that value proposition. Having a sponsorship policy. Now, I mentioned earlier that sponsorship is an implied endorsement of a sponsor. Now, if you're representing a nonprofit, you know, at its core, you are an advocacy organization. And advocacy organizations are all about credibility. You cannot sacrifice your credibility through a poor sponsorship or choosing the wrong partner in order to really go to the next level of what you're trying to do with sponsorship. We're going to talk about how you craft a sponsorship policy to determine what partners you would like to align with and how you'd like to create those relationships. We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about the assets that you can offer. We'll talk about pricing and the various ways that you can price your sponsorship. We're going to talk about sponsorship proposals. We had several questions prior to this webinar about proposals, and we're going to talk about prospecting. Not only the traditional ways for any property, any rights holder, including nonprofits, to find sponsors. We're going to talk about a really new area called social responsibility prospecting, and how exactly you can find the companies that we talked about today that are looking to express their social commitment, what they're looking for, and how you find them. So I'd like now to turn to questions that you've raised and use the remaining time together to answer those questions. So one question is, how would we advise a nonprofit with a very localized impact to seek sponsors who are trying to have a broader reputational impact beyond that neighborhood? That's a great question. So there are two aspects to it. One is your audience as a nonprofit, and the other is the audience of the sponsor. So your audience can be geographically constrained. It could be that you only work within one city, or one county, or one state, or one province, or one region. The sponsor, on the other hand, may have a local, regional, or national presence. If you have a regional presence, it is likely that you can have a regional impact. But the way for you to have an impact beyond the regional impact, if that sponsor wants something, say, national in origin, is to create what we call off-site resonance. And off-site resonance is when the sponsor can take the cause, can take its activities with you within the region that you operate, and use that as an example, as a paradigm of its activities much more broadly. To use that as its commitment, even though its commitment may be in only one city, it could use it as an example of its commitment nationally to a certain cause. So the question is, what is the quality of the sponsorship program that you put together? What is the quality of that communications campaign that describes that commitment of that sponsor? And how that sponsor can help lift that beyond the region that you operate and take that message more broadly. That's something that you'll talk about at the beginning of your sponsorship relationship as you plan what it is you're going to do together and how it is you're both going to promote that jointly. And thank you very much for that question. So the next question that I'd like to talk about, we had some questions about whether virtual events or virtual sponsorship will be important. And what we saw kind of aligned with the trends that we talked about today. And I wanted to thank the person who asked about virtual events, because this will become an increasingly important aspect of sponsorship beyond COVID-19. So when we are all vaccinated and when life approaches what is hopefully near normal, and we go back to live events and we go back to galas and other things, other events that you've had where people congregate together, virtual sponsorship and virtual events will still play an important part. And in fact, what we learned from virtual events from April forward is, if structured correctly, they can have as much resonance or greater than live events. Again, it's related to the earlier question that we just had about, can a local nonprofit have impact beyond its region? And the answer is yes. And virtual events are one way that we create this boundaryless sponsorship that helps take those messages to a much broader audience than a live audience. So we're going to see virtual events happen more and more. We'll see virtual sponsorships happen more and more. And in our next sponsorship, we're going to break down the individual components, not only of virtual sponsorships, but their continued live counterparts. But we'll talk about both and how you can lever both to take advantage of the trends that we talked about in this webinar. So do we have any other questions? I see no other questions. So wanted to provide the contact information for myself and for Pete Walke. If you have any other questions about the topics that we raised or about anything else that you might have a question about on topic, please feel free to reach out to myself or to Pete. Pete, do you have anything else to add before we close out the webinar?
No, I just appreciate folks tuning in and spending some time with us, and hopefully they got at least one or two good takeaway ideas that they could implement in their organizations.
Thank you, Pete. And so wanted to thank you for investing your time with us during this hour. Encourage you to come back next week, same time, same place, where we're going to really break down whether you are a large nonprofit or a very small nonprofit, no matter. We're going to share with you best practices in leveraging these trends with specific things to take your corporate sponsorship program to the next level. So thank you again. Thank you, CBIZ Retirement Plan Services, for your support of this webinar. And thank you all for your participation and your attendance today. If you could keep your browsers open and answer the survey at the end of the webinar, we'd really appreciate it. But thank you very much for attending.
Thank you.